Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Debt. It's something that most of us have dealt with at some point in our lives, but have you ever stopped to think about its history, about where the idea of debt relief came from?
I don't think most people realize just how far back it goes.
Well, that's what we're going to be exploring today. We're going to be taking a deep dive into debt relief, using this Wikipedia article on debt relief to guide us. And I've brought in an expert who can help us unpack all this. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, when I was doing a little bit of research for this, I came across this really interesting fact about ancient civilizations. Apparently, debt relief isn't some newfangled idea. It actually goes way, way back, like ancient times way back.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see the concept of debt forgiveness pop up in some of the earliest written records that we have.
Really?
Yeah. Take the book of Leviticus, for example, part of the Jewish and Christian tradition. It actually lays out rules for debt forgiveness.
So you're saying that debt forgiveness is practically biblical?
Well, in a way, yeah. And it's not just the ancient Israelites. The Hittites and the Hurrians, they had this thing called the Song of Debt Release. Civilizations in the Near East, thousands of years ago, clearly debt was a major issue for them.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I think I remember learning about it in a history class or something. It's pretty amazing how these ancient societies understood the whole impact of debt. I'm also remembering something about ancient Greece and Athens. Weren't they also big on debt relief?
Yeah, for sure. Back in Athens, sometime around the 6th century BC, a lawmaker named Solon, he instituted these reforms called the Seisachtheia. And not only did they cancel existing debts, but they also outlawed debt slavery.
Retail slavery.
Yeah, people were so weighed down by debt that they were literally forced into slavery to pay it off.
Wow.
Solon recognized that this was a massive problem and really took some serious action to change things.
So debt relief wasn't just, about economics. It was also about social justice.
Absolutely. And the idea of debt forgiveness as a way to, help those in need and benefit society, that appears in the Quran as well. The Islamic scripture encourages debt forgiveness as a form of charity.
Wow, it seems like pretty much every major civilization has had to grapple with this whole debt thing at some point.
It's a recurring theme throughout history, for sure.
Right. So we've kind of established that debt relief has this really long and interesting history. But I'm curious about more, modern examples. How has debt relief played out in, say, the past few centuries?
Well, I think a great example to look at is 19th century America. You had all these farmers who were struggling under a ton of debt, and their movements, their activism actually helped shape bankruptcy laws in the U.S.
Oh, right.
Which at the time was a pretty revolutionary concept. Imagine the idea that you could actually be legally relieved of your debts.
I know. It's amazing to think about how these grassroots movements can actually lead to such big changes.
Yeah.
What about examples on a more global scale?
Yeah. So on the international stage, you see some really significant examples of debt relief after major wars. Like, after World War I, the U.S. forgave, or at least reduced, a huge chunk of the war debts owed by its allies.
I guess they realized that rebuilding would have been almost impossible with that kind of financial burden hanging over them.
Exactly. And then, after World War II, you have the 1953 Agreement on German External Debts. It was a complicated agreement involving a lot of different countries, but it basically allowed Germany to resume war reparations payments after a period where they had been suspended. It was crucial for Germany's economic recovery and really is a major act of international debt relief.
Wow. So it really sounds like debt relief has played a huge role in shaping, the world as we know it today. I mean, it's not just about money, is it? It's about, giving folks a chance to get back on their feet, to rebuild their lives, even entire countries.
You got it. And as we move into more recent history, the whole issue of debt relief gets even more complicated, especially when you look at what's known as the Third World Debt Crisis.
That's what I wanted to ask about next. So how did that crisis unfold, and what was done to try and fix it?
Well, basically what happened was in the late 20th century, lots of developing countries found themselves in a really tough spot. They had all this debt, massive amounts of it, that they just couldn't pay back.
So was it just bad financial decisions on their part? Or
Yeah.
were there, other factors involved?
Oh, no, it was way more complicated than that. You had rising interest rates, global economic shocks, and yeah, there were some cases of irresponsible lending practices too. A whole bunch of things all coming together at the wrong time.
And what were the consequences? I mean, what happened to these countries when they couldn't pay back their debts?
It was pretty bad. It was a real humanitarian crisis, actually. A lot of these countries faced huge economic hardships, and they had to make drastic cuts to essential services like healthcare and education. People were really suffering.
That's awful. So what was done about it? I remember learning about something called the Jubilee 2000 campaign.
Yeah.
Was that related to all this?
Yeah, the Jubilee 2000 campaign was a big deal. It was this global movement that really brought attention to the third world debt crisis. You had all these different groups, religious groups, NGOs, activists, all coming together and calling for the cancellation of debt for the poorest countries. It was a really powerful movement, and they put a lot of pressure on world leaders and financial institutions to actually do something.
It's pretty inspiring, how a grassroots movement like that can have such a worldwide impact.
Yeah.
So what kind of concrete steps were taken to address the crisis? Did they just wipe out everyone's debt?
Well, not exactly. But under all that pressure, the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, or HIPC, was launched. And the goal was to give debt relief to, the countries with the most debt, free up some of their resources so they could invest in things like poverty reduction and development.
Okay, so that sounds promising.
Yeah.
But did it actually work?
The HITC initiative, and then later on there was another one called the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, or MDRI. They did help to reduce debt burdens for some of those countries. But, there were also some criticisms of how it all went down.
What do you mean?
Well, a lot of people felt that the debt relief came with too many strings attached. The countries that got help were often required to implement all these structural reforms, like privatizing state-owned industries, cutting social spending, stuff like that.
So it was like, we'll help you out, but you got to do things our way.
Yeah, pretty much. And these conditions were controversial, to say the least. Some people argued that they were actually harmful to the countries they were supposed to be helping. They worried these reforms would hurt local economies, make inequality worse, maybe even lead to social unrest.
Wow, so it sounds like a really complicated situation with no easy answers. Did these initiatives actually help or hurt in the end?
It's tough to say for sure. It's really a mixed bag. Some countries saw a significant reduction in their debt, and they were able to use those freed up resources to invest in things like social programs and infrastructure. But other countries really struggled with those conditions imposed on them. And even today, people are still debating the long-term impact of all those reforms. But it definitely highlights just how complex international aid can be and how tricky it is to balance debt relief with sustainable development.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thinking about all this stuff happening on a global scale has got me thinking about my own finances, too. It's hard not to when you're talking about debt, especially here in the U.S., where it seems like everyone's in debt to some degree.
That's a really important point. We've been talking about debt at the national and international levels, but it's crucial to remember that debt is a personal issue, too, and it affects millions of people every single day.
And it feels like personal debt, especially student loan debt, has just exploded in recent years.
It has. The amount of personal debt in the U.S. has gone way up over the past few decades. In fact, the article mentions that in the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, all that non-housing personal debt, credit card debt, auto loans, student loans, all that stuff, it reached like $2.71 trillion.
That's crazy. And you're right about student loan debt. I feel like I hear stories all the time about people who are just drowning in student loans.
Student loan debt is definitely a huge problem. In 2003, it was about 12% of all non-housing personal debt. But by 2017, it had jumped to 53%. More than half.
Wow, more than half. And the article also said that student loans have the highest rates of serious delinquency. What does that even mean?
Serious delinquency means people are at least 90 days behind on their payments, and that's a big red flag that a lot of folks are in real financial trouble because of student loan debt. It can impact their lives in so many ways. It can make it really tough to buy a house, start a family, save for retirement, all that stuff.
So what can people do if they're struggling with all that debt? What are their options?
Well, there are a few different paths they can explore. Bankruptcy is one option, and in the U.S., you've got Chapter 13 and Chapter 7. Chapter 13 lets you restructure your debt and set up a more manageable payment plan, whereas Chapter 7 is more about selling off assets to pay off debts.
Bankruptcy sounds pretty intense, though. Are there options that aren't quite so, drastic?
Yeah, there are definitely alternatives. Debt consolidation is one. It's where you combine all your debts into one loan, usually with a lower interest rate, so you can simplify those payments and hopefully save some money on interest. And then there's debt settlement. That's where you try to negotiate with your creditors to pay back less than what you owe. It can be tricky, but it's an option.
Okay, so those sound a little less scary than bankruptcy. But I mentioned it's really important to do your homework before you jump into any of those, right?
Absolutely. You really got to understand the pros and cons of each option. And it's super important to talk to a reputable credit counselor, someone who can give you personalized advice based on your situation. There are unfortunately a lot of shady companies out there that try to take advantage of people who are just desperate to get out of debt, So you got to be careful, got to be informed.
Good advice. You know, when I was reading the article, I came across this really surprising example of like large-scale debt relief that happened right here in the U.S., in Texas of all places.
Oh, you mean the driver responsibility surcharge?
Yeah, that's it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what was it and why was it such a big deal?
So, back in 2003, Texas started this program called the Driver Responsibility Surcharge. And they tacked it on to fines for certain traffic violations, things like, driving without insurance or a license, driving while intoxicated, stuff like that.
And they were using that money to fund road construction.
Well, that was the idea, at least. But it turned out that a lot of that money was actually being diverted to hospitals. And a lot of those road projects that they promised, well, they never happened.
So not only were people getting hit with these extra fees on top of their fines, but the money wasn't even going where it was supposed to.
Exactly. And for a lot of Texans, these surcharges became a real nightmare. They couldn't afford to pay, and if they didn't, their licenses could get suspended, which of course made it even harder to work, take care of their families, even just get around.
I think the article even mentioned people ending up in jail because they couldn't afford to pay those surcharges.
Yeah, it was a very controversial program, and eventually you had all these people, including law enforcement officials and judges, speaking out against it. They argued that it was totally unjust and that it disproportionately impacted low-income Texans.
So how did they finally get rid of it?
Well, it took a lot of work, a lot of advocacy, but finally in 2019, the Texas legislature voted to abolish the driver responsibility surcharge. They finally recognized that it was just causing more problems than it was solving.
That must have been a huge win for all those people who were struggling under those surcharges.
It was. The abolishment of the driver responsibility surcharge wiped out something like $2.5 billion in debt owed by about 1.4 million people. That's a whole lot of people who got some much-needed relief.
It's actually really inspiring to see that kind of change happen, even on such a large scale.
It is. And it wasn't just the surcharge. Texas also got rid of those red light cameras, and they made it easier for judges to waive certain traffic fines. It seems like they were really trying to address the problem of excessive fines and fees in a more holistic way.
It's a good reminder that even in a state that, isn't always known for its progressive policies, meaningful debt relief is possible if there's enough public pressure and political will.
For sure. It's interesting how debt pops up in all sorts of creative works, too, like literature, film, even music. It really shows how this whole issue is woven into the fabric of human experience.
Yeah, like Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, right?
Yeah.
That whole play revolves around debt and mercy and the consequences of greed.
Exactly. You've got Antonio, the merchant, who borrows money from Shylock, the moneylender. And when he can't pay it back, Shylock demands a pound of Antonio's flesh as payment. It's pretty intense. But then Portia, disguised as a lawyer, comes in and gives this incredible speech about mercy and forgiveness.
Yeah, it's a powerful story, and it really shows how debt can create such high stakes and how it can lead to conflict and violence.
It definitely makes you think about justice and fairness, especially when it comes to money. And speaking of economics, even The Wizard of Oz has been interpreted as an allegory for those big political and economic debates of the late 19th century, particularly the debate over free silver.
Wait, The Wizard of Oz? Seriously, I always thought it was just a kid's story about a girl and her dog. What does free silver have to do with any of that?
Well, back then there was this huge debate in the U.S. about whether the country's currency should be based on gold or silver. And the farmers, who were often in debt, they supported the free silver movement because they thought it would cause inflation, which would make their debts easier to pay off. And some scholars believe that The Wizard of Oz is actually a reflection of that whole debate.
So how does that connect to the story?
Well, some people see Dorothy as representing the average American, and the yellow brick road is the gold standard. And those silver slippers she wears, they represent the possibility of a silver-based currency. And the Emerald City, that's like the illusion of wealth and prosperity that the gold standard supposedly promised.
Wow, that's a whole new way of looking at The Wizard of Oz. It's amazing how a story that seems so simple can have all these deeper layers of meaning.
It really is. And it shows how art can be a reflection of the social and economic issues of its time.
Are there any other works of art that deal with this idea of debt relief?
Oh, yeah, tons. A more modern example is that movie Fight Club from 1999. The main characters end up destroying credit card records, which is shown as them, like, blowing up skyscrapers. It's a pretty extreme and violent take on debt relief, but it symbolizes this total rejection of the whole consumerist system.
It's definitely got that, anger and frustration that a lot of people feel towards debt and the power that financial institutions have over us.
Right. Fight Club is definitely dark and satirical, but it taps into a very real sentiment. And then there's that TV show, Mr. Robot, where you've got this group of hackers trying to take down a huge corporation and erase everyone's debt.
It's fascinating how all these different works of art approach debt relief in such different ways. You've got legal and political debates, acts of mercy, even violent rebellion. It makes you think that debt isn't just an economic issue, it's a human issue. It touches on morality, social issues, psychology, all of it.
You said it. Debt's been around for centuries, and it's not going away anytime soon. As long as we've got systems of borrowing and lending, there's going to be debt. And as long as there's debt, there's going to be this need for some kind of debt relief.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About how debt relief has been a part of, well, pretty much everything, throughout history, even in our culture and our stories and things.
It's a pretty universal theme when you think about it.
Yeah. And, before we started this deep dive, I have to admit, I kind of thought debt relief was, a pretty simple idea. But it's obviously a lot more complicated than that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are so many layers to it.
We've seen how it can be this really powerful tool for, for helping economies recover, for promoting social justice, for helping nations rebuild after wars and other crises.
It can be a lifeline in a lot of ways.
But we've also learned that it's not this magic solution, that it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
There's no easy fix, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. We've talked about all the complexities, the debates, the potential downsides, and I think it all boils down to this: how do we balance the need for responsible lending and borrowing with the understanding that sometimes debt relief is just necessary?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a tough one.
It is, but I think what I've learned from this whole deep dive is that even just asking these questions, it's a step in the right direction.
Absolutely. I mean, if we can understand the history, how debt relief has been used, all the arguments for and against it, then we can start to have these more informed and nuanced conversations about it.
And I think those conversations they're crucial because debt really does affect all of us, in some way or another, whether it's our own personal debt or the national debt or even the debts of other countries.
Yeah, we're all connected in a lot of ways, and the decisions we make about debt, well, they can have ripple effects all over the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Go for it.
The next time you hear about debt relief, whether it's in the news or in a conversation with friends or even if it just pops into your head, think about what we've been talking about today. Think about the history, think about the complexities, and think about the people, the real people whose lives are affected by all of this.
Don't just accept things at face value. Ask questions, Challenge those assumptions. Look for different perspectives.
Because finding real solutions to these challenges, it takes all of us. It takes us being engaged, being informed, and being willing to think critically.
Well said.
Well, thanks again for joining us today and for sharing all your insights. This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
It's been my pleasure. These are the kinds of conversations we need to be having.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep the conversation going.